Greetings, programs. Welcome to episode 10, Epistemology. You don't know how to think. So epistemology sounds all super complicated and stuff, but basically it's a study or philosophy of how to tell if the stuff you're saying is justified or legit or not. From Wikipedia, epistemology, the theory of knowledge, especially with regards to its methods, validity and scope, and the distinction between justified belief and opinion. And that last one, opinion, is a big deal, because a lot of folks really can't tell the difference between an opinion that they hold and reality, and that's kind of troublesome. Or to put it another way, epistemology, how you know what it is you think that you know. See footnote number 1 for the Wikipedia entry on this. Now, everybody thinks that they know this already, and they don't. Few people outside of lawyers, scientists, or philosophers really do. And we'll be coming back to the lawyer bit later. That part's really useful. So the first very basic step is to accept the idea that basing all of your decisions on reason and evidence is the most sensible and effective way to determine the truth about reality. No, I will not be going into esoteric stuff like how do you know the world is really real and so forth. That's a fun conversation, but for now we're just going to assume that there is a real world and that we are in it. So why do we accept that reason and evidence are the gold standard for figuring out reality? Well, basically, because it works. It is so ingrained in our Western society in financial and legal matters, because we already accept it. And as can be demonstrated at any workplace, when you tell your boss, "No boss, I did not check the results of the project. I tossed the runestones and they came up great, so there's no need to check." Yeah, try that and the aforementioned boss will either be calling a hospital or organising your final paycheck. Why? Well, we already know that's a stupid thing to do. On some instinctive level, we know that's going to not work, backfire at the very best. And consider how you would feel if you wanted to make a major life decision, like buy a new car or buy your first house. You'd want to see solid evidence, payment schedules, get it checked over by a third party that you trust, like a mechanic or a builder. And consider how you would feel if the person then told you, "I just know in my heart that it's good." Or if they said, "I had a vision that it was great." No, you'd want evidence, not faith. Sorry, while faith might be reassuring, it's not a path to truth. There is no position that you cannot take on faith. So how would you use it to determine the truth? In everyday life, we can recognize that there are better and worse ways to determine the truth of things. For example, you could take measurements, that's one way. You could ask an expert. You could guess. Just pick a number at random, or you could have faith. Now, we can understand why guessing might be wrong. We could get any answer with no reference to reality. Taking measurements is pretty good. You might make a mistake, but in general, measuring things is very useful at getting accurate information on the world. Asking an expert gets you the experience of that expert, as well as their history with the subject, which usually involves lots of measurement. And then there's faith. Commonly described as strong beliefs in the doctrines of a religion based on a spiritual conviction rather than proof. In other words, belief without evidence. If you had evidence, it wouldn't be faith. This is not greatly different from guessing, really. But why without evidence? Well, if you had evidence for your belief, you don't have faith, you have reasons. Those reasons might turn out to be in error, but relying on the evidence is at least rational. Because if the evidence became more complete and shows your belief to be in error, you can then update those beliefs to more accurately map to reality. And faith itself has been described in other contexts as pretending to know things that you don't know. Because if you cannot in fact show somebody the reasons for your belief, then as much as you might not like the idea, you are making a pretense of knowing things. And if you cannot provide evidence, you cannot truthfully say that you know something. And you certainly can't demonstrate it to another person, which is one of the best ways of discovering that you have in fact made a mistake. And we all know on some level, once we've gotten out of childhood, that believing things to be true doesn't make them true. For a clear example, look at members of other religions, other than yours if you have one. They believe every bit as strongly as any other person, more so in many cases. Moreover, many of them are willing to die to prove the point. Do you believe that hard? There are people on Earth right now that are convinced that they have been abducted by aliens. There are others that believe that they have spoken with gurus and fakirs that can levitate or perform surgery with their bare hands or even walk on water. Does the strength of their belief make their beliefs true? No? So evidently, the strength of any belief does not make it true. It is the evidence that backs the belief that makes it true. Have you ever thought that you were right and then been shown that you were wrong? Was it a pleasant feeling? I would say no. Do you want to make sure that you are not wrong? So what is the best way to go about that? Would it be better to check if you were wrong than to assume you were right? Evidence, yes? See footnote number 2 for a lecture by Peter Boghossian on faith. So the next important question is, what is evidence? Well, strictly speaking, evidence is anything that you present in support of your claim. For example, pixies are real, they make bricks. Look at the bricks, that's evidence that pixies are real. Yep, technically speaking, bricks are evidence of pixies. However, that's not normally what we really mean, is it? No, not what we really mean by evidence is solid, testable evidence that withstands scrutiny, or even rational evidence. So how do we tell what actually counts as meaningful evidence? Evidence is that which points to one and only one conclusion for the topic under discussion. And this is a key point. For example, if you're trying to determine what color something might have been, and you think it's red, and then you find data showing that it could have been red or blue, that data is not evidence that it was red. It is, however, evidence that it was not green. So while it's not actually evidence, it can point in the right direction. So if there is an alternate explanation that fits the data presented, then the data presented is not evidence for the thing you are trying to prove. Take the pixie example. Yep, it's silly, but no one's going to get emotionally attached to it, so it'll do for now. Are bricks evidence of pixies? No. Why not? Well, because we know there are other explanations for bricks. We know that humans have made bricks since time immemorial. We can see bricks being made today still. They still have their uses. Ergo, bricks are not evidence of pixies. The only way that bricks would count as evidence would be if pixies had already been established as existing, independently of this, and of also making bricks. And even then, it would only be weak evidence, one possibility. The only way it would constitute solid evidence for the existence of pixies, strong evidence, would be if no other way of making bricks was known. Say, for example, we lived in a world where, yes, all bricks are made by pixies, and humans have no clue how to do it. You cannot use an unknown as evidence for another unknown. For example, if you came across a strange set of tracks in a forest and you do not know what made the tracks, it might be reasonable to declare that an animal made those tracks, because animals exist. But to declare that it was the tracks of a magical creature like a dragon or a set of fairies is incorrect, not rational. Why? Because dragons and fairies have not been shown to exist. They are magical, supernatural creatures, and no examples are known. And such as they are described by most people, such creatures are not actually possible. So this brings us on to standards of evidence. And as has been described by many famous people, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Christopher Hitchens is most recently famous for popularizing this phrase. So what does this mean in effect? It means that the further from the existing norms that the claim is, the more evidence is needed, and the more rigorous the standards for that evidence need to be. For example, if you live in the UK and you claim that it's raining, this is such a common thing that your word will most likely suffice. But if you lived in Death Valley in California, somehow, that would be a more extraordinary claim, given that the valley is one of the driest places on Earth, and it is so hot and so dry that often the rain that does fall there evaporates before it even reaches the ground. Yeah, that's the thing, go look it up. So we would need more and more rigorous evidence to establish the claim. Wet feet would not be enough, not in Death Valley. There are other explanations. Spilled drinks, animals peeing on your feet, a prank, etc. And if someone were to show you a wet patch of ground, that could be explained by a leaking water tank, or a drink bottle, or a spill, or whatever. Because the most likely explanation in Death Valley is something like that rather than actual rain, given the extreme rarity of rain and the extreme commonness of water bottles, especially where people are involved in the desert. But a large area soaked wet and no sign of a rapidly retreating fire truck would probably do it, especially if the area covered was too large for such a stunt and you could still see the clouds in the sky. That would be evidence, good evidence, for rain in Death Valley. So how do we balance this stuff? Well, in general, the more serious the cost of failure, the more stringent the standard of evidence. And you see this in everyday life. When it comes to buying a house or a car, investments or your retirement, you'd want to be sure, wouldn't you? And thus you demand a high standard of evidence, because the stakes are high and the price of failure is high. The higher the stakes, the more care and the better assurances you need. This is rational. Because for something with little or no downside, or no cost, it doesn't really matter if it leads to failure. The same cannot be said for larger projects with major costs. When it came to a major life decision, like buying a home, you would not accept as evidence any of the following, would you? It's true for me. I did it and my life changed for the better. I believe that it's true. I have a book about it. No. Imagine if you were buying a house, and when you asked for evidence of things like plans, or ownership, rates, payments, what have you, the person selling the house said any of these things. Even if they were a person that you knew, would you be reassured? I would say no. Why not? Because you know that none of these things would count as evidence in other contexts, like in court. Why not? Well, the court must be as right as humanly possible. And the court recognizes that people can be wrong, they can be misled, they can even lie, or they can just simply misunderstand. They can also be making the best judgment possible on the basis of faulty information. And a claim is not true just because it's in a book. Evidence is what makes it true, and while this can be described in a book, the book is not the evidence, the book is the claim. You see this in science textbooks all the time. The comments in the book are not the evidence, however well written they may be. The explanations of the data, the details of the experiments conducted, and the results found, which are described in the book, that's the evidence. For example, comic books contain details about the life of Spider-Man, but they themselves do not constitute evidence for the existence of Spider-Man, do they? No, they are the claim of Spider-Man, if we were to take them seriously. Evidence is that which is concordant with and indicative of only one conclusion. If a piece of information could be used to support several conclusions, it is evidence of none of them. Which means if an alternative explanation can be found that the evidence also supports, then that evidence is not evidence. It also means that if you have to believe in it first before you can see it, it is not objectively verifiable and thus not evidence, but more fits into the realm of self-deception. If the only way you can see the fairies is to fast and chant for days and really convince yourself that fairies are real, and then maybe take drugs, and only then can they be seen, that's a big clue that fairies are not real. And this is where the lawyer bit that I mentioned earlier comes in. This is where I have to thank Blair again. As mentioned in a previous video, Blair kept me thinking critically by skewering me anytime I went out on a limb. So I learned to be slightly paranoid about shooting my mouth off about things without checking first. Go watch a few procedural cop shows or procedural lawyer shows. Even CSI will help, even if you're not a fan. Consider how, when in a good show, the heroes present a case. They have to show how they know what they know. The case has to stand up to highly motivated people who are looking for flaws. They have to show they're working. They cannot just show up and say, Smith did it, we have evidence, and then walk away. The evidence must be examined by all parties and hold up to scrutiny. So for our own part, we have to cultivate an internal attitude of skepticism to our own ideas. We have to pretend for a moment that if we get something wrong, something bad will happen to us. Embarrassment, costs, something we want to avoid, anything, doesn't matter. And then with that in mind, check the evidence that we're using. Or use the outside view. If someone said it to you, and you were looking to pick holes, what would you say? What is the source of this information? Does that person have a sensible reason to lie? How likely are they to be wrong or just overlooking problems? What evidence besides what they just said to you do they actually have? Is there anything other than their say-so that they can point to? Which brings me on to my next point, that claims are not evidence, and this is one I see a lot all the time on YouTube. If I tell you that brick-making fairies are real, do you believe me? I hope not. Fairies, as most people understand them, are supernatural, and thus, as far as we can tell, impossible. But what if I tell you that I have evidence in the form of 100 testimonials attesting to the reality of fairies? Now, real testimonials are just people's opinions. They can give you some idea, but they are not themselves good evidence. They could have just picked the best ones and ignored all the ones that say there's no such thing as fairies. Their opinions could just differ from yours about the reality of such things. They could even be fabricated. But still, with 100 people agreeing that fairies are real, that does at least give it some weight. That's 100 people that at least agree they might have something there, might be worth looking into. And while 100 people can all be fooled or even convince themselves, it's less likely than one person being fooled or self-deceived. Now, that might not be enough when you were wanting to buy a house, but it might do if you're just going to say, try out a new brand of shampoo, because there's little to no cost. But what if none of those testimonials had any names or contact details? If they had no way of getting in contact with them and asking those people about their experiences? Just labels like A. Smith or an impressed mother of two. But what if those testimonials lacked even that? What if the book about fairies said that hundreds of people saw the fairies at the local fair, but none of those people are named, or mentioned anywhere else, or in the history books? What if it happened so long ago that none of those people are even alive now? Then really, what you have there is not weak evidence, but it's another claim, a claim that the evidence does exist. Now, at the end of the chain, real evidence must come down to some detectable difference in reality, something above the level of a personal opinion, just like in a court of law or in a science lab. And whatever it is, it must point to only one interpretation, for it to be evidence of that thing, or it is not evidence for it. But what about self-deception? Human memory is unreliable, we know this. See footnote number 3 for details about how unreliable memory really is. And if we are under pressure, as we know, such as social pressure or part of a group with a very clear need, we know how easy it is for us to convince ourselves of something. Doubly so if we have strong emotional reasons to convince ourselves of something. We will look for reasons to be right and overlook reasons where we may be wrong. See footnote number 4 on details about motivated reasoning. In reality, the easiest person to fool is ourselves, because we know all the buttons to push to convince ourselves. This is not something that can be said for other people. This is why it is so important to check the evidence, and to check your reasoning with the reasoning of others. In the end, the final arbiter is the evidence, not somebody's opinion of the evidence. So to wrap this up about evidence, first question you should ask yourself is, how do you know? Where did you get that information? What evidence is there for the subject? Is there evidence of greater weight than somebody's mere opinion? Does this evidence have an objectively verifiable existence? Next important question, are there any counterexamples? Can you think of any instances where your ideas would be wrong? What evidence would exist if you were wrong? What would show you to be wrong? And the last question, ask yourself, how could my belief be wrong? What conditions would have to be in place for my belief to be incorrect? If you can prove yourself wrong, do it now before someone else does it, and then you can correct your beliefs. And this is all part of critical thinking, which can be summarized thusly. 1. Believe on the basis of evidence. 2. Don't pretend to know things if you don't know them. And 3. Be more humble about presumed knowledge. Assign lower confidence values to belief for which we may not have adequate justification. This is why science is so hard, and when done right is so effective. Because if you can spot and expose any flaws, you can correct those flaws and make a stronger theory. This is why peer review is so powerful. Other people can spot the things that you have overlooked. And it's really counterintuitive. You have to try really hard to prove yourself wrong, and fail. And the harder you try, the better result. My mental model for this is testing or training. The harder you train and the harder the tests, the better the person or the product will be when it passes those tests. And while the fruits of science cannot be argued with, the basis of the science is so backwards from how everyday people actually think that it causes massive problems for regular people who think about it. So make sure your evidence is solid. Test it. Test the ideas. check to see if you are wrong, and you'll do well. That's all for this week. Next week I will be looking at cognitive biases, possibly as part of an ongoing series. Bye for now.